The aroma of fresh coffee and the murmur of travelers filled the air as Elena Carter entered the bustling airport terminal. The morning sunlight poured through the high glass windows, illuminating her path to the check-in counter. She had been up since dawn, ensuring every detail of her trip was perfect. Her navy blazer and crisp white blouse reflected her polished demeanor, while her comfortable leather flats hinted at her practicality. With her carry-on bag in one hand and her phone in the other, Elena double-checked her flight details. Everything was in order. Flight 372. First-class ticket. Departure in 2 hours. A smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't her first time flying, but it was the first time she had treated herself to first class. It was a small reward for countless hours she had spent building her nonprofit organization, which had finally turned a corner toward success. The first-class check-in line was shorter than she expected. Behind the counter stood a man in his 40s with slicked-back hair and a name tag that read Paul. His posture, arms crossed, eyes scanning the line, suggested impatience. Elena stepped forward when it was her turn. "Good morning," she said warmly, sliding her ticket and ID across the counter. "I have a first-class ticket for Flight 372. Paul picked up her documents with an air of distaste. His eyes flicked over her ticket, then up to her face, lingering a second too long. A faint sneer curled his lips. "First class?" he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "Yes," Elena said, her smile faltering slightly. She could feel the weight of his gaze dissecting her as though she didn't belong. Paul tapped a few keys on his keyboard, his expression darkening. He looked back at her ticket and then at her again. "There seems to be a problem," he said, his voice colder now. "This ticket isn't valid for first class." Elena blinked, her brows knitting together. "That's impossible," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I purchased this ticket weeks ago. It's confirmed." Paul's smirk grew. "Well, it doesn't look like it's valid now," he said, tilting the ticket slightly as though to emphasize its supposed flaws. "Could you please check again?" Elena asked, keeping her voice steady despite the irritation bubbling beneath her calm exterior. Paul sighed loudly, tapping the keyboard with exaggerated force. He glanced at her again, his eyes filled with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right place? First class is for priority passengers." "I'm aware of that," Elena replied, her patience beginning to wear thin. "I bought a first-class ticket. I'm sure there's been some mistake." Paul's smirk didn't waver. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Look, ma'am, we've had issues with people trying to, how should I put this, upgrade themselves. If you can't afford first class, economy check-in is down the hall." Elena froze, the words hitting her like a slap. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, their curiosity mingled with judgment. The unease she had felt earlier was now a full-fledged discomfort. "I don't think you understand," Elena said, her voice sharper now. "I paid for this ticket. I have the confirmation email if you'd like to see it." Paul straightened, his smirk fading into a look of feigned exasperation. "Security," he called over his shoulder, waving a nearby guard toward the counter. Elena's stomach dropped. "What are you doing?" she demanded. The guard approached, a tall man with a stern face. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between Elena and Paul. Paul pointed at Elena. "This passenger is being disruptive and refusing to move to the appropriate line," he said. "That's not true." Elena shot back, her voice rising. "I've done nothing wrong. I simply want to board the flight I paid for." The guard's eyes lingered on her for a moment before he turned to Paul. "What's the issue with her ticket?" Paul shrugged, his smirk returning. "It's invalid. Probably bought it off some discount site. You know how these things go." Elena clenched her fists, her frustration boiling over. "That's a lie," she said, her voice steady despite the anger coursing through her. "I bought this ticket directly from the airline. Check it again." The guard hesitated, but Paul waved him off. "No need. We can't hold up the line for someone trying to scam their way into first class." The humiliation was suffocating now. Elena glanced around, seeing the whispers and stares from other passengers. She took a deep breath, willing herself to remain composed. "You'll regret this," she said softly, her voice firm with quiet resolve. Paul chuckled. We'll see about that. As Elena turned to leave, she pulled out her phone, her fingers dialing a number she hadn't used in a while. Her calm demeanor didn't waver as the line connected. I need a favor, she said into the phone, her voice calm but edged with steel. Can you send the jet? She hung up and walked away from the counter, her back straight, her head held high. She didn't look back, but the burning sting of humiliation stayed with her. What Paul didn't know was that this wasn't the end. Far from it. In 10 minutes, everything was about to change. The faint murmur of voices surrounded Elena as she found a seat near the large windows overlooking the tarmac. The bustling terminal felt distant, a blur of movement and sound. She clutched her phone tightly, her hand trembling not from fear, but from the simmering anger that had yet to subside. Her thumb hovered over her contacts. She took a deep breath, centering herself. It wasn't just about the insult she had endured. It was about the principle, about the blatant disrespect she faced simply because of her appearance. Elena tapped the screen and dialed. The phone rang twice before a familiar, warm voice answered on the other end. Miss Carter, is everything all right? It's not, Elena replied, her voice steady but firm. I need the jet. Now. There was a pause, a slight intake of breath as the man on the other end processed her words. Understood. Where are you? She gave her location, her tone clipped but polite. I need it here in 10 minutes. It'll be there, the voice assured her. Do you need anything else? No, she said, her voice softening slightly. Just the jet. Thank you. As she ended the call, she leaned back in the hard plastic chair, her pulse gradually slowing. The rhythmic motion of planes taking off and landing outside offered a strange sense of calm. The storm inside her, however, was far from over. Paul, the gate agent, stood behind the counter, smugly processing the next passenger's ticket. He spared a glance in Elena's direction, watching as she sat alone by the window. A satisfied smirk played on his lips. He had dealt with her type before, people who thought money or confidence could mask their inadequacy. To him, Elena was no different. She was just another person trying to punch above her weight. And he had done what he believed was his job, maintain the order and exclusivity of first class. His attention snapped back to the line when a passenger cleared their throat impatiently. Right, he muttered, returning to his task. The faint roar of jet engines drew Elena's attention to the tarmac. She straightened in her seat, her heart quickening as she saw a sleek private jet descending gracefully onto the runway. Its polished exterior gleamed in the sunlight, its elegance a stark contrast to the bustling chaos of the commercial terminal. Passengers nearby began to notice the jet as well. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some craned their necks to get a better look, while others speculated aloud about the VIP on board. Elena remained still, her gaze fixed on the plane as it taxied closer to the private gate. A dark SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the glass doors of the terminal. The chauffeur stepped out, his movements swift and precise. He scanned the area before making his way inside, heading directly toward Elena. Miss Carter, he said, his voice low and respectful. Your jet is ready. Elena stood, her movements deliberate. She felt the weight of every stare as the room seemed to quiet, curiosity overtaking the hum of conversation. She adjusted her blazer, lifted her chin, and nodded. Thank you. The chauffeur escorted her toward the private gate, his presence commanding enough to part the crowd. Elena walked with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She didn't look back at the first-class counter, but she felt Paul's gaze on her, heavy and disbelieving. The SUV was waiting just outside, its engine idling. The chauffeur opened the door for Elena, and she slid inside, her expression composed but resolute. As the car drove across the tarmac toward the waiting jet, she allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't about showing off. It was about reclaiming her dignity, about reminding herself and others that she wouldn't be dismissed so easily. As the car came to a stop, the jet staircase lowered. The crew stood at the top, waiting to greet her with warm smiles and professional courtesy. Elena stepped out of the car, the cool breeze brushing against her face as she ascended the steps. She turned one last time, her eyes scanning the airport terminal in the distance. From where she stood, she could see the commotion her departure had caused. A group of passengers crowded around the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. Somewhere in that crowd was Paul. Elena didn't wave. She didn't acknowledge the crowd. She simply stepped into the jet, the door closing behind her. The interior was a sanctuary of luxury, cream leather seats, polished wood accents, and soft ambient lighting. Elena sank into one of the plush chairs, exhaling deeply. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, informing her that they would be airborne shortly. As the engines roared to life, Elena pulled out her phone. This time, she drafted a message to the airline's executive team, detailing the experience she had endured. Her fingers flew over the screen, each word chosen with precision. Before she hit send, she paused, her thoughts lingering on Paul. She didn't want revenge, not really. What she wanted was accountability, respect. Satisfied, she pressed send and placed her phone aside. The jet began to ascend, the ground falling away beneath her as the city disappeared from view. Elena allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. This wasn't over, not yet, but for now, she had reclaimed her peace, and that was a victory worth savoring.